is a special 2018 post-draft edition of the Seahawkers podcast. I'm Brandon Schultz of the Military Seahawkers, and joining me, Rob Staton of SeahawksDraftBlog.com. Rob, how you doing?
Really good. Thanks for having me on again, and really looking forward to sort of delving into this draft class now that we know who the player. This is always the most interesting part for me, is when we know who the Seahawks have actually drafted. You know, it's fun to sort of think about who they might take, but now we know who to look at. We can really get into them and discuss who are going to make up this transitioning Seahawks team in 2018.
Yeah, rather than spending, 10, 15 minutes watching a few YouTube highlights on a particular player, now I've found myself, watching a lot more of Rashaad Penny, a lot more Shaquem Griffin, and all of the videos that have come out since he was drafted. And, there's going to be plenty of these. Rasheem Green drafted in the third round, so we got a lot to talk about. But let's start off with the biggest story of the draft, and that is the Seahawks selecting Shaquem Griffin in the fifth round. We've talked about it leading up to the draft. Born with amniotic band syndrome, had his hand amputated when he was just 4 years old. Overcame everything that he went through as a kid and being told that he couldn't play football to now being drafted into the NFL. I was noticing, the average for player hands in the NFL has always been 2, but now, for the first time in league history, that average drops below 2.
Yeah, certainly, and it's a great story. I think I've not spoken to any Seahawks fans who didn't want them to draft Shaquem Griffin. He's the player that I think most people wanted to see in Seattle. I'm not daft. I think most people would say it's because of the sentimental story. They want to see the two brothers reunited. They want that feel good factor. But I think the one thing with Shaquem is that he is a really good football player, and we talked about him in previous podcasts. If people go and watch the Auburn game in the Peach Bowl, it is one of the best individual performances you'll find of any player in any game. I mean, it was relentless in that game. Over 12 tackles, 1.5 sacks. Had this huge hit on a fumble return on an offensive lineman, just completely wiped out this offensive lineman on a fumble return from, I think, Mike Hughes, who got drafted in the first round, was returning it. And just a really, really talented football player. Now, I've seen all kind of suggestions like, is he going to be the replacement for KJ Wright? Is he going to be a safety? Where are they going to use him? I think you have to be realistic about what he is. He's going to be a situational pass rusher, a nickel linebacker, and he's going to be a special teams demon. I would never care to rule anything out with Shaquem Griffin. He's gone through so much and proved so many people wrong. But there are reasons why he's never going to be a full-time linebacker for me. And there are just simple things like he's going to really struggle to shed blocks sometimes. He's going to really struggle to set the edge against the run. These are just little things that are going to be unavoidable, I think, at the next level, especially in the NFL. They're going to show up a lot more than they did in college. But you can still get a really good player. Look, the modern NFL does things a little bit differently than they did 15 years ago. There's a role for somebody who's just going to be screaming off the edge on a blitz. There's a role for somebody who's just going to spy a particular mobile quarterback on a given game plan. There's a role for guys on special teams to, this year at least, when the kickoffs are still there, to be a huge factor. And he's going to be a heart and soul player for this team. I just think that it's not just a sentimental pick. He is a really good football player. I think he's going to become one of the immediate heart and soul players on this roster at a time when they kind of need some of that. They've lost some big characters. They've lost some leaders. They've lost some people who've set the example. And they've replaced that with a guy like Shaquem Griffin. He's the player that we all wanted to see. When I've just flown home from Florida today, and while I was out there, I was staying in Central Florida and bought a hoodie with UCF on the front purely in anticipation of the Seahawks drafting Shaquem Griffin, and was delighted that they made that pick just before I actually got on the plane. They made that pick, and certainly celebrated that because we were preparing to leave.
Well, and John and Pete, they said the sentimental part of it is cool, bringing him on to play with his brother Shaquille. But they were excited about the football player Shaquem Griffin too. And yeah, you mentioned there's some issues there with his game, and that's the reason why he fell to pick 4 of round 5. Otherwise somebody would have taken him much sooner. But there was a lot to like. Particularly the effort that he put into those situations are what the Seahawks liked about him. And you brought up the Auburn game, but the fact that he was able to get to the passer so often on third down, when it really mattered. That's the reason why they really liked him and picked him when they did.
Yeah, I mean, he had more tackles for a loss than I think there may have been one or two players. Maybe he was the leader for tackles for a loss last year in the whole of college football. And when you watch UCF play, you understand why. I mean, he is just electric as a blitzer. On a third down situation, Seahawks fans are well used to sort of these 3rd and 15 completions that are given up by the Seahawks. And in a situation like that, you put Shaquem Griffin on the field and you just let him go and attack the quarterback, and he'll get there. He will impact a quarterback on those obvious passing situations. And players like that are very, very valuable these days. And if Pete Carroll's defenses love to try and shut down the run early on. They like to try and put teams into unfavorable third down situations. If you can get teams into 3rd and 8, 3rd and 10, 3rd and 12, and then put Shaquem Griffin on the field and say, go and get the quarterback, you're going to get teams off the field. And that he could be a really valuable player for that alone. And that's not including some of I think the comparison that some people have made is that he could be a Malcolm Smith type of player. And there's definitely some of that. Malcolm Smith in 2012 and 2013 was quite sneakily a really important player for the Seahawks, not just in the Super Bowl, but he had interceptions, he had big plays, he was part of the tip, of course. And you could see Shaquem Griffin doing a little bit of that, not playing every down, but sort of having a role on the defense where he can still have an impact. So I think that it's a really good pick, great value in the 5th round. The guy that the Seahawks fans needed something. They needed something positive to get into after the loss of Sherman and the loss of Bennett and a free agency period where there was a little bit of talk of Ndamukong Suh for a while. And then he ends up signing with the Rams, who have this incredible offseason where they can bring in all these big name players, and the Seahawks fans needed something to lift them. And I just get the feeling that the Shaquem Griffin pick has really lifted this fan base.
Well, we got an email from Crackeraya, says, Wonder Twins unite. I don't know if it's this way with you guys, but this feels absolutely special to me. And I feel like great things are going to happen with these two guys together on the same team. Griffins, go! So I could sense it just among the fans after the selection, just how excited so many fans were. And I think it says a lot too about the kind of personality Shaquille has. And then to see these two guys back together and just seeing the video of the call coming in, it was a pretty cool moment, I think, for a lot of Seahawks fans.
Yeah. And for the last few hours, I just can't get this image out of my head that he's going to make a big play in a game, whether it's in his rookie season or down the line, that he's going to make a play in a really important game that maybe it wins the Seahawks a game or something, that he's just going to have this major role, that it's set up for him to do something big in a particular game. And that happened for him at UCF. In the conference championship against Memphis, it went, I think it was like 3 or 4 overtimes. It was this incredible game. There was nothing between the teams. You've got Anthony Miller playing his heart out for Memphis. You've got Shaquem Griffin playing his heart out for UCF. And he came off the edge, blitzed, impacted the quarterback. I think it was an interception that was forced because of his pressure. He ends up winning the game for UCF with that. And I've just got this feeling, whether it'll happen in 2018 or sometime in the future, that he's going to have a big play for the Seahawks to win them a game.
And special teams impact too. I mean, you talked about this already, but 230 pounds and ability to run a 4.3 40, pretty impressive, and a guy that you can put on special teams. And he didn't miss a lot of tackles, right? I mean, maybe not an outstanding tackler, but an average tackler at least.
Yeah, and he will lead by example. People will see him on the practice field and be inspired by what he's doing, and he just gives everything. I mean, he doesn't leave anything out on the field. I mean, his full effort is just incredible. And it's not just the Auburn game; it was every week. He didn't just save it for the big games. He would give everything. I mean, this is a guy who has had to prove himself over and over again to try and get opportunities, let alone to have an opportunity to go on there and do something special like help UCF to an undefeated season. So I don't think he's going to take this for granted. I think this is the remarkable thing about Shaquem Griffin, is that he has all of this attention and focus. Just imagine what the last few weeks have been like for him. So at the Senior Bowl, a few interviews, maybe it's an interesting story. Some of the media want to speak to him about how he's come through and he's going to get this chance in the NFL, and people kind of see him as an undrafted player, a 7th rounder type. And then he goes to the combine and has the 4.38, and then he's viral around the world. People are watching the video, people are wanting to learn about him. And then he gets to the draft. And, I worked for the BBC back in the UK, went on the BBC Sport website, immediately after the draft, and it was the second biggest story on the BBC's front page, on the sports page, is that Shaquem Griffin is the first player with one hand to be drafted for the NFL. So he's a worldwide story. I don't know if people noticed this. Pete Carroll actually said to him in the phone call when they drafted him, "Stay humble."
Yeah.
And there's no worry with this guy. That's just Pete saying what Pete has to say as the head coach. Mm-hmm. But Shaquem Griffin, he's just had attention and attention and attention for 6 months, and he's never changed. His personality is unbelievable, and the character of these two brothers, they're so modest and humble and likable. There's no danger to me that as he becomes more and more of a well-known player and someone that people are rooting for, I don't think he's going to veer off and let this get to his head. I think he's just going to continue to inspire people. He's obviously inspiring a lot of kids out there who are suffering with very similar issues in their life and are born with this syndrome. And, to inspire them and to do what he's doing out there and to stay level-headed despite all of this attention, I think it's credit to him. And I just can't wait to see him playing for the Seahawks now.
Well, it certainly overshadowed what the Seahawks did on the first day, which got some fans stirred up a little bit. But this is something, Rob, that we talked about the week leading up to the draft, that the Seahawks could make a statement by going in, drafting running back with their first pick overall. And that's exactly what they did, drafting Rashaad Penny at number 27 after trading back with Green Bay. They pick up a third-round pick, number 76 overall, which they ended up trading away to the Steelers. But they get running back Rashaad Penny, San Diego State, with that pick. Probably not the running back that most people had coming off the board, second of the group of running backs.
No, but this is the thing that people need to remember with this. The Seahawks will do things their way, and that's always been the case under Pete Carroll and John Schneider. They've never done what conventional wisdom will tell them. And at a time when more and more people are saying you don't need to even run the ball in the NFL, or that running's not important, I mean, certainly a lot of noise about that on Twitter these days, on Seahawks Twitter. As more and more people say stuff like that, they're not bothered. Pete Carroll wants to run the ball. He wants to be a run-focused team. He feels that has to be part of their identity, that the defense and the running game and the point guard, quarterback, and the special teams all have to come together to complete the circle in order for the Seahawks to be at their very, very best. And we've seen what it looks like. The Seahawks have won a Super Bowl with Pete Carroll in charge. We've seen how good they can be when they have a functioning run game. Now, they're never going to find another Marshawn Lynch. That player doesn't exist. I mean, he is a thoroughly unique player. There will never be another Marshawn Lynch. You're not going to recreate that. What you can do is you can put a good running game on the field. And the Seahawks have not had reliable running backs the last few years. CJ Prosise can't stay healthy. Chris Carson, as much as everybody likes Chris Carson, he played 4 games last year, was injured the previous year for Oklahoma State, had I think something like 80 carries in that season. The year before was suffering with injuries as well. He's not been reliable. Sadly, he's not been reliable with injuries. And Thomas Rawls, after a promising start, completely went off the tracks. So they needed somebody that they could trust, that was reliable, that fit their prototype in terms of size, in terms of physicality, in terms of what he's able to do as a feature of the offense. And they've got that now. And they had their pick of the running backs. They could have gone for anybody other than Saquon Barkley, and this is the guy that they chose. I'd feel worse about this pick, and I know people have said it's a reach and stuff like that. I'd feel worse about this pick if, for example, Nick Chubb had gone off the board and maybe Geis had gone off the board, or Michelle, and then they took him as the 4th best running back in the class. And we were left wondering forever, had their guy gone off the board and they'd settled on this guy. Mm-hmm. There's no doubt now. We know that this was the guy, this was the running back that they wanted. It was just obvious that they were going to do something to fix this running game. They'd said it over and over again. Pete Carroll kept saying the priority is to fix the running game. There was a great chance they were going to take a running back with their first pick, and to pick Penny and for him to be their guy left no doubt whatsoever that this was the guy that they were targeting. And he's an exciting player. He's quick, great acceleration, great special teams player. He's going to contribute there as well. The game against Stanford was fantastic. The bowl game against Army was fantastic. There's an awful lot to like about him.
He had a good showing at the Senior Bowl.
Senior Bowl was really good. A great run to kick things off, and then the touchdown on the scramble drill. I'm sure we're going to see plenty of plays like that with Russell Wilson at quarterback. So I like the pick. I like the statement it makes. We want to run the ball. We're going to do this. Don't care what the rest of the NFL is doing. We're going to play Seahawks football. Love the message it sends.
Well, and speaking of what the rest of the NFL did, as soon as Penny came off the board, you saw the Patriots take Sony Michel. Then a couple picks later, you saw the Browns take Nick Chubb. Then you saw the Bucks take Ronald Jones. And not too long after that, the Detroit Lions took Kerryon Johnson. So these were all running backs that we talked about kind of being in that, if Saquon Barkley was on his very own tier, it was this group of running backs that was at the next tier. And like you mentioned, for the Seahawks to go and have their pick and get their guy, you have no doubt that was their top-rated back. I guess there is some of the questions of whether or not they could have rated him even higher than Barkley just based on his elusiveness in college. We saw a lot of those numbers coming out after the draft. The most elusive running back Penny was in his college career. And a guy who, if he gets hit behind the line of scrimmage, he's going to gain yardage. And based on the history of the Seahawks offensive line, that's going to be something that they value.
And Brad, there's something that I think people need to realize here as well, is that people get too focused too much on the perception of he was the number 27 overall pick. They took him in the first round, and that influences their opinion on this. There's two ways of looking at this. If the Seahawks had traded down into pick 35, which is only 8 picks later than they actually took Rashaad Penny, and then took him there maybe after some of these other running backs had got off the board, people would feel better about it. And that's just silly because it's just numbers. You're still taking him with the first pick. So that's one thing. The second thing is they took Rasheem Green with their second pick.
Yeah.
Now, for me, if you were saying, right, from this draft class, you've got 2 picks in the first 3 rounds, and you're going to take a running back and a defensive end, who are you going to take? If they'd have taken Harold Landry, who was always a bit overrated for me anyway, with the first pick, and then taken whoever was left at number 76 to improve the running game, and there weren't many running backs left at number 76.
No.
If they'd have done it that way round, they would have been worse off than taking the guy that they actually wanted at running back with the first pick, and then coming back and getting Rasheem Green, who for me is a top 50 player. They got 2 top 50 players with their first 2 picks, and they turned 18 into 2 top 50 players, and they did it the right way round. You had to get a running back with the first pick, might as well have the one you actually want, had to get a defensive lineman at some point. They got that with their second pick, and they got a guy who probably won't be at his very, very best this year, Rasheem Green, but 2 or 3 years down the line, could be one of the better defensive linemen in the league. I mean, that's the potential that he's got. So I like what they did with the first 2 picks. When you actually balance it out and say if they'd have taken these guys at 45 and 46 instead of 27 and 79, then you'd probably feel a little bit better about the situation. So just forget the numbers, look at the players, look at the message it sends, look at them doing what they want to do, and I think you'll feel a bit more positive about these picks.
Yeah, perception on this is very interesting to me because, you wrote on your blog this weekend that the 49ers and Raiders may have screwed over the Seahawks by drafting, they each drafted a tackle, so Cleveland couldn't move up into that number 18 spot. And there was that projected trade of Tony Pauline saying that the Browns could trade their 30, their pick, their 2 picks in the second round, early on in the second round, to the Seahawks, right, for that number 18 pick. Now, if they do that, everybody's looking at that and going, oh, wow, what great value the Seahawks got for their 18th overall pick. They get 2 picks in the second round. Well, if Rasheem Green and Rashaad Penny are there at those 2 spots in the second round, there's probably not a whole lot of people saying anything about the Seahawks. They're having really anything negative to say about those 2 picks at that spot.
Yeah, and I think there's a really good chance they had Rasheem Green graded as a second-round pick anyway, so it could easily have been Penny and Green as the 2. Let's say they trade down to 33 and 35. It could have been those 2 players, or it could have been another defensive lineman or whatever. Sometimes you focus too much on the actual number next to the player and what we're planning and what the team is actually planning here. And the other thing I've seen quite a lot on Twitter since the draft is, well, the Seahawks traded down in round 3, went back 3 spots. The player they were really after was Sam Hubbard, and he went at 77, so they had to settle for Rasheem Green. I don't believe that whatsoever. I think what happened with pick 76 is the Seahawks said, we like Sam Hubbard, we like Rasheem Green. If we trade down, at least one of them's guaranteed to be there. So we'll trade down and get the extra pick because we know we're going to get one of the 2. They probably had them graded exactly the same.
Sure.
And maybe Sam Hubbard was a point ahead of Green, but they don't feel that's enough of a difference to avoid trading down. If they did feel that way, they would have just taken Sam Hubbard. It was for a 7th-round pick, for crying out loud. Do people really think they're going to risk losing out on a player they really like in Sam Hubbard for an extra 7th-round pick? I mean, that's just not realistic. And it was clear that they just probably liked both players. knew at least one would be there if they traded down, and they took Rasheem Green. I think the Seahawks had a really difficult challenge in this draft. They had number 18 and then nothing to 120.
Yeah.
That's a really difficult position to be in as a GM, as a head coach, as John Schneider and Pete Carroll were. To get Green and to get Penny out of those 2 first picks, I think you've just got to say fair play. They made the best of a bad situation.
Well, and that's why I think even if the trade with the Browns didn't materialize, it still essentially worked out just as well by getting a couple players that were valued in that same area anyway. But let's talk about a little bit about Green. We did mention Green leading up to the draft a couple weeks back, talking about him on defense because they did have a visit with him. You know, a big interior type pass rusher that can also rush off the edge. You were really impressed with his ability to rush off the edge too.
Yeah, I think that's what he does best. I think that he has played some snaps inside, and you see some really good stuff there. The Ohio State bowl game, that USC, they lost quite heavily in the game, but Green came away better than any other player for USC on that day. He had a pass rush against Billy Price where he just absolutely stole his lunch money. I mean, the rush from the inside, and you do not see Billy Price get beat this way. You just don't. I mean, I've seen nearly all of Billy Price's games from last year because I was focusing on him as a possible Seahawk earlier in the process. You just don't see him get beat, period. And Green just beat him like he was a 7th round pick. This is a guy who went, I think it was number 22 overall to Cincinnati. So, you know, he's a really good player. Green beat him there. You see him doing a lot of what Malik McDowell did a year ago. So the great thing about McDowell, when he was moved inside, Michigan State used him as a nose tackle for some reason, even though he was never suited for that kind of position. And he would do this one-arm ball rush where he just drove the center of the guard deep into the backfield, impacted so many plays. It was freaky. It was unnatural. And Green hasn't quite got the one-arm bull rush that McDowell had, but he's got a bull rush that he's driving people into the backfield from an interior position that weighing like 279 pounds, playing as the nose tackle. So they were both freaky athletes in that regard, and that ability to do that. The great thing about Green that McDowell wasn't quite as good at is that McDowell was really predictable rushing off the edge. He had basically one move that he would do over and over again. He was really good at it. It was like a little counter move, swim and then a dip. And you know, he would master that move, but tackles would learn it. So there was a game against, I think it was Notre Dame, Mike McGlinchey ended up with the San Francisco 49ers. After a few snaps of seeing this same move from McDowell, knew what to do and knew how to handle it. Green's got much more of a repertoire. I think he's a much more natural edge rusher, better speed off there, can win with quickness, can bend. It's a really interesting pick, and he's not the finished article, but there was definitely a sentiment within the league. Lance Zierlein does the NFL.com bios, had produced a quote from, I think it was an AFC executive or a scout, saying that if he'd have actually returned for his 2018 season with USC, then in a year's time he could have been a top 10 pick. That is how much potential Green has got. Now, teams have allowed him to move into round 3. There was a bit of an injury issue there, according to John Schneider. He is quite raw. I don't think he's quite the alpha male that maybe some teams were looking for there. But this was a weird draft. I mean, how many people actually dropped? Sam Hubbard, nobody expected him to be there in round 3. Who expected Holton Hill and Quentin Meeks and Brandon Fakison to be undrafted? You know, there was so many players falling in this draft. So the fact that another one did in Rasheem Green, I'm not going to focus too much on that. I'm just going to say the Seahawks got a really good value pick there. You know, I'm not just being positive for the sake of it here. You know, I wouldn't do that if I didn't think this was the right things for the Seahawks. We could talk about how they've got themselves into this difficult situation by trading picks and not having the second, not having the third rounder. There's legitimate cause for complaint there. But in terms of this is the cards they've been dealt, this is what they had to deal with in the draft to get Penny and to get Green with their first 2 picks. That's very hard to criticize the Seahawks, what they did in those first 2 rounds. They did really well with those first 2 picks.
Well, you mentioned Lance Zierlein's draft profiles on NFL.com. Rasheem Green, Adam and I were very familiar with his profile because Lance said that Green didn't have enough sand in his pants to play interior at the NFL level. So, and that he looked, and one of the positives, his strengths was that he looked like a baby colt, just getting his legs underneath him. So,
I think the comparison they made was Carlos Dunlap, and I think that's a really interesting comparison because I think they could be Carlos Dunlap, but the thing with Dunlap for me is he was always kind of that guy who could set the edge, had the great size, could sort of handle that. And although Pete Carroll says that he could play 15 pounds heavier than he is right now, and he's about 275, get up closer towards that 300-pound range. I think that he's got a little bit more quickness off the edge than maybe Carlos Dunlap has got. So maybe he hasn't got that anchor, maybe he hasn't got the sand in the pants enough to sort of do some of that bullying stuff. Maybe in his first year, he is going to be more of an edge rusher rather than someone who dips inside too much, maybe just does it on third downs. But there's just incredible potential there. 34-inch arms, the great size, the great quickness. Seems like a decent enough guy. Like I say, he's not that sort of screaming and shouting alpha male that's going to come into the locker room there, take it over and be Michael Bennett's personality.
Yeah.
But maybe the Seahawks don't really need that. They've already got people like Jaron Reed, Frank Clark, Doug Baldwin. Cam's still around and presumably he's going to be part of that locker room, even if he doesn't play. So, maybe they didn't quite need another one of those. They just needed somebody who could actually rush the passer, which was a vital need.
Well, another big development for Seattle that came through during the draft was in the 5th round. The Seahawks used one of those picks that they got from, I believe it was Pittsburgh, to trade up and select Michael Dickson, punter from Texas.
Yeah, and I'm fascinated by this one because being from England, I'm very familiar with the game of rugby. It's very popular over here as it is in Australia. It's always amazed me at the differences between. It's something that I'm quite geeky about in the watching the way that the NFL teams kick field goals, the way that they kick their punts and handle all of that, compared to how they do things in rugby. And I think there's definitely something for the NFL to learn from those sports. Aussie rules is very different to rugby. Very, very different game. A lot more kicking involved in Aussie rules than there is in rugby. In rugby, you kind of have the same 2 or 3 guys, maybe it's a couple of guys who will kick the ball deep downfield, and then they will handle the field goal duties. In Aussie rules, it's pretty much there's a large number of players who will kick the ball, lots of different techniques there and styles. And I don't study punters, and during the season, it's very hard to diagnose who is a good punter and who's a bad one, unless you just so happen to watch a particular game when a punter has a great game, or if they talk up on a broadcast. It's hard to sort of focus on punters in college football. But now that the Seahawks have drafted him, I've gone and had a look at some of those clips. John Schneider mentioned he was the MVP in the bowl game for Texas at the end of the season. And you watch some of the things he's able to do with the
let's
ball.
just not gloss right over that. He was the MVP in a bowl game, a punter.
Yeah, and
that's pretty crazy.
The Seahawks scout was there, said he was clearly the best player on the field. So we're talking about Texas here. They've got some 5-star recruits on that roster. Yeah, and watching him, there's some of the stuff he can do. If people want to, what do people think you're going to get in the 5th round? I mean, I know that the expectation has been set that you're going to get Cam Chancellor, Richard Sherman every year, just because it's happened once. But what do you think you're actually getting in the 5th round here? If the Seahawks get a player who is a substantial contributor for the next 5-6 years at a really good cost off the back of this pick, and they were going to have, if they don't move on from John Ryan this year, they're going to have to do it soon. I mean, he's getting it up in age now.
Oh, he's the longest tenured Seahawk that's on the team by far.
He's not going to play forever, so they have to start thinking about where they're going to save some money. Who's going to be the future on special teams. They also, I like the fact that they're preparing for a proper competition here as well. Mm-hmm. That's something they didn't have at kicker last year. They just kind of anointed Blair Walsh. Now they've got 2 guys on the roster competing for the kicking job. They've got 2 guys competing for the punter's job. I like that because special teams is important, and the Seahawks special teams for 2 years in a row now, like the running game, just hasn't been good enough.
You have 2 picks now in the 5th round where it's a focus on special team with Shaquem Griffin and Michael Dickson. And it was interesting to hear John Schneider in the press conference talk about Michael Dickson and almost set it up as if to say, now, this doesn't mean that John Ryan's not going to be on the team this year. This means that there's a competition here, because he referenced his time in Green Bay. They drafted a punter in the 3rd round, didn't make the team. So he's making it known to Seahawks fans that, yes, this is for competition. And although there's a lot to like about what Dickson does, it's no sure thing. And you brought up the Aussie rules, football, because Michael Dickson was born in Canberra, Australia. So he has that's where that tie to that background is, right?
Yeah. And one of the things that is kind of frustrating about NFL fandom and people who cover the sport is that they have these, people make their mind up too often. An open mind is something that people should be more willing to have when thinking about the NFL. So you have the group who say never draft a running back early. presumably these people would never want the Seahawks to draft a clone of Marshawn Lynch in the first round then. I mean, Marshawn was originally a first rounder. Are you never willing to draft Marshawn in the first round? Because that's pretty much just what you're saying if you'll never draft a running back early. And then you get people who would say you would never draft a punter or a kicker, that, they can find these guys, they're just on the street or whatever. You can get them as undrafted free agents. Well, how important has Justin Tucker been to the Baltimore Ravens for the last few years? If Justin Tucker was in this draft class, would you be willing to spend a 5th-round pick on him to avoid any more Blair Walsh catastrophes in the future? I mean, that's the thing. If you eliminate a whole position from your mind, if you say, I will never do this, you're just taking potentially good players off your board. There's no reason to do that. In my personal opinion would be, would I take a running back in the first round over a fantastic pass rusher or a quarterback or an offensive tackle if I had a need at those positions? Probably not. Am I going to rule it out completely forever and a day? No. Are you going to rule out ever taking a punter in the 5th round just because it's a punter? Well, why would you do such a thing? Keep an open mind about this. And if the Seahawks find a Pro Bowl punter from this pick and he's part of the team for, even if it's just for 5 years, and then he maybe leaves in free agency or whatever, is that not worth a 5th-round pick? Of course it is.
We saw the focus on special teams, and we also see the focus on the running game, yes, with the first pick overall with Rashaad Penny, but also with the tight end, Will Dissly, out of Washington, with the with their 4th-round pick, 120 overall.
Yeah, I love this pick. I mean, and again, people may not be, given the way that the Seahawks have gone the last couple of years and they've struggled a little bit, or have struggled more than they had in the previous few years, people might be less enthusiastic about the Pete Carroll brand of football. But, I like it. I like this old school feel that they want to run the ball. They want to be physical. There's nothing. I personally take more enjoyment out of a team that is just aggressive, that just rams it down your throat, that can go on the road and set the tone and almost act like the home team on the road. I enjoy that much more than just watching a quarterback throwing it 45 times a game and just trying to finesse your way to a title. And Will Dissly is a further statement of commitment to the run game. He's not pretty. He's not Jimmy Graham. He's the complete opposite of Jimmy Graham. And I was never one of the Jimmy Graham hater. There was never somebody who just took pleasure in knocking Jimmy Graham, and he scored 10 touchdowns last year. That's going to be difficult to replace. But Jimmy Graham was a move away from sort of that physical tone-setting style of play that they wanted to use. If they'd used him just as a receiver, then fine. But they tried to turn him into the complete tight end, and it just didn't work out. And they seem to have just acknowledged that they moved away from what their true identity was. They've gone back to what it was now with a blocking tight end in Will Dissly, who's a great run blocker. They've got Ed Dickson, who's a great pass blocker at tight end. Nick Vannett's still there on the roster. Tyrone Swoops could eventually develop into something of a pass catching option there. I think they've got some good tight ends now, and I just like this style, this commitment to the run. It's going to be. I sense that they've done enough now to at least give themselves a chance to do it. The pressure's going to be a little bit on. When you draft Rashaad Penny in the first round and Will Dissly and people like that, Seahawks fans are not going to be patient through the first 4 to 5 games if the Seahawks continue to run the ball for 50, 60 yards a game and the running backs are struggling in the red zone. People's patience will wear thin if that happens again this year. But with DJ Fluker coming in, Mike Solari coming in, a more detailed, focused offensive line coach rather than just X's and O's and stuff like that, and trying to coach up athleticism. Solari's going to be a bit more focused on detail. You've got Dwayne Brown now, who's going to have a full off-season with the Seahawks and starting there. George Fant's going to be coming back. Posic's got another year under his belt. Fetty's got another year under his belt. Adiambo's still got another year under his belt. You've got blocking tight ends. You've got some nice pieces there at running back. Russell Wilson's healthy. Everything is set up now to really get this running game back on track. And I'm a big fan of this Will Dissly pick.
Well, it sounds like you're addressing all of the criticism that we've seen among Seahawks fans who would say the Seahawks didn't do enough early on to pay attention to the offensive line. It's something that's continued to be a problem. But then they go and they do get Jamarco Jones, who fell all the way to the late 5th, the left tackle out of Ohio State, and who's apparently, according to their press conference, expected to compete with Dwayne Brown, so probably a backup. But in the press conference, one of the interesting things was you mentioned George Fant, but they're talking about him now potentially competing over on the right side.
When you only have a limited number of early picks, you have to prioritize your needs. And if the Seahawks had have had the picks that the New York Giants had, I mean, the Giants picked number 2 and took Saquon. They picked, he was 34, his second pick in round 2, and took Will Hernandez. And then in the third round, took Lorenzo Carter and BJ Hill. I mean, that is a fantastic quartet, but they've had 4 early picks there. You know, they had to give up Jason Pierre-Paul for a third rounder to get to that. They had to have a horrendous season last year to get to that. You know, if the Seahawks had had those picks, they would have taken, no doubt, they would have taken an offensive lineman early. You know, whether it was Austin Corbett, whether it was Hernandez, whether it was Isaiah Wynn, they would have taken an offensive lineman early in this draft if they got 4 early picks. Yeah. But they had 1 early pick, which was number 18. They were able to turn that into 27 and 76. Then they have 2 reasonably early picks. If you go offensive line, say you take Isaiah, I love Isaiah Wynn. If they took an Isaiah Wynn at 18, then you don't have the pick at 76. You're waiting until the 4th round or the 5th round to address defense and the pass rush, which, you know, people would have criticized that, saying, well, how are you going to replace Bennett and Averill and Sheldon Richardson if you only have 1 pick at number 18? You've got to sort of work out where you're going to spend your resources. And in the past, they've spent second rounder on Posick, they've spent third rounder on Odiambo, they've spent second and third round picks on Dwayne Brown, they've spent a second on Justin Britt and paid the guy a first rounder on a Fedi. So they've spent a lot on the offensive line over the last few years. So you wait to the 5th round, you take Jamarco Jones, a pretty average player on tape. He didn't stand out when I watched him. He had the length and the size that you looked for. He wasn't a bad player at Ohio State. He's just not somebody who really sort of leapt out and said, wow, you know, look at this guy. And then he had a terrible combine, which is why he's ended up going in the 5th round. He's pretty much the opposite of what they've done in previous years. Rather than going for upside and athleticism, they've gone for someone who's perhaps had a bit more proven ability in the Big Ten at a big school and not been a liability, but is not an athlete and is going to need to sort of really hone his craft if he's going to have any kind of success at the next level. So it's the opposite of what they've done in the past. But again, you're balancing things out. You get a Jamarco Jones in the 5th round. Who's the pass rusher you're getting in the 5th round? Who's the running back you're getting in the 5th round? It's about trying to find where the cliffs are at each position. And I think this is a value pick. He's somebody who could be a backup left tackle for a long time. And I think we learned last year that backup left tackle is an important role. As soon as George Fant got injured, Reese Odiambo couldn't do the job. They had to trade for Dwayne Brown. If they've got Dwayne Brown now and George Fant and potentially Jamarco Jones who can play left tackle, they're well covered at that important position.
The final pick of the 5th round that we have yet to talk about, Tre Flowers, safety out of Oklahoma State, and they've already talked about converting him as a cornerback, particularly because he has the height, 6'3", long arms, over 33-inch arms, and also has the 4.4 type speed that they like to see at their corners.
Yeah, and he's a really interesting guy because when I was watching the combine, there was, I don't know if anybody saw this, but during the cornerback drills, it was one of the least impressive sets of workouts I think I've ever seen at the combine. I mean, the cornerbacks just were atrocious. Josh Jackson, who was, I think he went in the 2nd round in the end to Green Bay, had 4 or 5 false starts during the drills. So he would line up to do the drill, would then make a mistake early on. The coaches would have to stop the drill, explain to him what he did wrong, have to do it again. I think on the one particular drill, he had to start and stop the drill about 2 or 3 times. And the coaches were getting a little bit frustrated there. I was getting frustrated because for some reason they had the cornerbacks out there for about 3 hours doing drills. So it was just delaying things. He wasn't the only one. It was a pretty miserable experience watching the cornerbacks at the combine. And then the safeties came out and the safeties ran quicker in the 40-yard dash. And then when they started going through the drills, you were thinking, hey, these guys look pretty good, look better than expected. And there was one player in particular who stood out, and that was Tre Flowers. And he stood out because watching him run the 40 and doing the drills, he did not look like a safety. He looked like a Seahawks corner. I mean, if anyone was watching it, you just straight away, I just said, that's a Seahawks corner. He's long and thin. Exactly the same kind of body type that Richard Sherman had, that kind of long, thin, not overly muscular, almost lanky kind of body frame, long arms, just that type of build. And immediately just think, that's a Seahawks corner. I remember writing in a combine review and the review of that day and in the overall combine review saying, keep an eye out for this guy. And I actually mocked him in quite a few Seahawks 7-rounders saying he'll be a safety to cornerback convert for the Seahawks because he's got the body type, he's got the frame, great tackler at safety for Oklahoma State. You're thinking, okay, there's another thing the Seahawks love. They love good tacklers in the secondary, especially at corner. So everything was set up for him to come in and be a development player for the Seahawks. The cornerback class wasn't good. They didn't show well. There weren't that many guys who fit Seattle's physicality prototype. Here's Tre Flowers, tackles well, ran well, looks like a Seahawks corner. great pick in the 5th round. If you can't get excited about a cornerback drafted in the 5th round by Pete Carroll, where have you been for the last 8 years? Let's see what he can do.
Well, moving on to the 6th round, you talk about pass rushers available in the 5th. This one was there in the 6th. Edge rusher Jacob Martin out of Temple.
Yeah, Temple have done the old coach who went on to Baylor. They did a really good job of finding tough, physical, hard-nosed players who were just sort of really gritty. I guess Jim Mora would call them dirtbags. That's what they had for the last few years. And you see people like Hassan Reddick coming through, and that's the kind of mentality that a lot of these guys have. Some people have actually compared him to Hassan Reddick, and he's not as quick as Reddick. Reddick had an elite 10-yard split, quicker 40, stuff like that. But in terms of the explosive traits, which is very important at defensive line, he was really, really good. Had a really good broad jump, had a good vertical jump. He seems like a good size for the Leo. It was a bad draft for edge rushers, especially with Josh Sweat obviously falling because of his injury issues there. Unless you were going to get Marcus Davenport. I mean, this is one of the reasons why New Orleans moved up, because I think New Orleans said we need an edge rusher and we ain't going to find one where we are, and we ain't going to find one in the 2nd, 3rd, 4th round. So we'll trade up and get Marcus Davenport and we'll go all in on him. Yeah. Bradley Chubb, one of the reasons why Denver didn't risk trading down, let's just take Bradley Chubb. Kimoko Toure went really early in the 2nd round. He's probably a 3rd round player, goes in the 2nd round because the edge options weren't there. So the Seahawks acknowledge that, wait till the 6th round, go and get a guy who fits with your mentality, with explosive traits, with the attitude that you're looking for. Go and bring him in and see what he can do and try him out. And if it doesn't work, they've got Rasheem Green who's going to play the edge this year a little bit. And next year, it is going to be a fantastic defensive line class. So, yeah, you do have to plan ahead sometimes and acknowledge that this was a draft where the strengths were running back and interior offensive line. Next year, the strengths are very much going to be defensive line.
And again, another guy who can compete on special teams if need be too. It sounded like they already had him targeted as a special teams type player as well.
Yeah, and you can't have enough of those. I mean, we talk about things that haven't worked for the Seahawks, and special teams is one of them. And it's not just Blair Walsh, and it wasn't just John Ryan last year. Yeah. It's the coverage as well. The kickoff coverage has not been as good as it has maybe like 2012, 2013. So they need to find some options there. I've seen people complaining that the focus in the later rounds was on special teams. But again, what do you expect? Do you expect the Seahawks to find 3 down starting defensive and offensive players in the 3rd day of the draft?
I think they're gone by then.
It doesn't happen very often. And some of the guys who could have done it ended up going undrafted and probably went undrafted for a reason. So yeah, if you get a good special team and someone who can play as maybe a nickel rusher and develop into a pass rusher over time, go for it. Why not?
Well, that brings us to our round 7 selection. Alex Mcgough, quarterback out of FIU, just the 2nd quarterback taken by the Seahawks in the Pete Carroll, John Schneider era.
Yeah, and he's a player that in the last couple of weeks just seemed to get a little bit of buzz. They were talking about him, I think, on the NFL Network, and people were rushing to try and work him out. I think he may be a player that teams came to late in the process. Maybe just focused on other players. Then someone, maybe a scout, saw him play or did a workout and said we need to spend a bit more time on this guy. He suddenly seems to have a bit of a buzz there. I think he had a VMAT visit late in the day as well, like right at the end of the deadline. He came and visited with the Seahawks. And John Schneider mentioned it. I'd not watched any of him before the draft, but then I had to go and see him after John Schneider talked about him in the press conference after the 3rd day, because he was talking about his release. And at one point, John Schneider said his release is very similar to, and then he kind of stopped and lost concentration for a moment and sidetracked and went onto a different strand. And I really want to know who he was comparing him to, because having actually seen his release point now, it's the craziest thing. Sometimes the ball comes out, it's like he's throwing it almost side. It is like a sidearm, but it's like a high sidearm, and he whips his arm around. It's because it's a really weird throwing motion, but it's effective. And there's a nice little competition going on at quarterback now. You've got Austin Davidson there, you've got Stephen Morris, you've got this guy coming in too. So it's all about competition. There's nobody been gifted a job this year at many, many different positions. And like Rashaad Penny's going to have to try and earn a job, starting job. I don't think he's going to be handed that. Chris Carson or Mike Davis could win that job. Penny's going to have to come in and compete. The backup quarterback's going to have to compete. The kickers and the punters are going to have to compete. Pete Carroll is taking control of this team again. He wants competition across the board, and he's going to get it this year.
Well, I think one of those things that he did mention, and maybe this is what sidetracked him in that press conference, was their accuracy when moving off their spot, and just how Mcgough ranked in among the college quarterbacks coming out of the draft this year, because number 1 was Baker Mayfield. He said number 3 was Sam Darnold, and number 2 in between those two guys was Alex Mcgough.
Yeah, and they mentioned a few times in the press conference afterwards that they have these metrics and ways of determining things that we don't know about, sort of analysis and analytics that a lot of the teams will have, but they're not in the public domain. Yeah. So they have information that we don't know about. And this is the thing about any kind of draft. We don't get to interview the players. We don't get to sit in on the interviews. We don't get to see the private workouts.
Medical records.
They bring these guys into the VMAC and have them just hang around the staff and see how they interact with the staff to see if the kind of personality that fit with them. The Seahawks have essentially a psychologist who does their combine stuff as well, who's one of the best in the world. And there's so much information that the teams have that we don't have. That means we'll never be able to predict exactly how this thing's going to play out because we don't have anywhere near any of the information these guys have. And that was one of the stats that my ears picked up a little bit when John Schneider said that as well, because it's the kind of thing that you don't know unless a GM mentions it. And when you have Baker Mayfield 1, Darnold 3, and this guy sandwiched in the middle, that's interesting.
Very much. And that takes care of all the draft picks. Let's talk just briefly before you go on some of the guys that are looking to come in. A long list of players. But I think the two names that jumped out at me were Poona Ford, defensive tackle from Texas, who we talked about, the 5'11", 300-pound defensive tackle out of Texas, and then Khalid Hill, fullback out of Michigan. So you're seeing again the focus on offense with the run game with Hill, and then just a guy with a chip on his shoulder, Poona Ford.
Yeah, I think with Hill, it was important. It's important they have a fullback on the roster this year. I mean, they didn't really have that last year. They say they want to be a running team. They say they want to be physical, and you don't carry a fullback. And I get it. You don't want to. Sometimes you don't want to tip your hat to the opponent saying, "Look, when the fullback comes in, we're going to run this particular play," or maybe they were a bit too predictable sometimes with fullbacks in, and teams were guessing what they were going to do. That's a possibility, and maybe they wanted to go away from that. But if you want to be a tough, old school, physical running team, then you kind of need a fullback on the roster. And they've got one or two options now that they could look at. I think there's a bit of talk that maybe Mike Davis could convert and try a bit of that as well to get a bit of versatility out of him. I could easily see Will Dissly. I think that I'm right in saying in the past, Brian Schottenheimer's used a lot of 2 tight end sets, and the tight end can even drop back in and play a bit of fullback as well. I wonder with Disley's versatility whether they'll have him doing that if these fullbacks don't work out. Maybe that's another option for them. So, I like the fact that they seem at least open to having a fullback on the roster this year. And with Poona Ford, he was the leader on the defense in Texas. He's a player who had a good pro day and felt it was a major chip on his shoulder that he'd not been invited to the combine. He'd had a really good Senior Bowl and an East-West Shrine game performance, and it got people talking there. Didn't get invited to the combine, put a chip on his shoulder. Has always kind of had that because he's a shorter player, 5'11", not a prototype height for a defensive lineman, but he's got really long arms. The Seahawks still haven't drafted a defensive lineman with sub 33-inch arms. He's above that, despite the lack of height. He's going to be. I'm intrigued to see how he gets on, because theoretically, we talked about this in the podcast. If he's shorter, it's going to be tough to get into his pads. And if he's longer, he's going to keep people off his frame anyway. He's going to win a lot of leverage battles with this kind of frame and length. So I'm intrigued to see what he can do in the NFL.
Definitely excited to see what's coming up for the Seahawks. Rob, thanks again for coming on and talking about our picks here.
Yeah, anytime. Look, it's an exciting time now. We get to see these guys compete in training camp. Whether or not the Seahawks are going to be back to their absolute best this year, I'm not sure. But I don't think they had enough stock and enough cap space in this free agency period to sort of put themselves at a 2013 level. I think what they have done is set the wheels in motion to try and get back there. So lots of things to be positive about. They made the best of a bad situation with their lack of picks. Bring on training camp. It can't get here soon enough. Let's see how these guys perform.
And I'm sure we'll continue to see stuff from you at SeahawksDraftBlog.com. Although, are you going to take a little bit of a break maybe coming up here after you have a chance to view some of the tape from some of these new players?
Yeah, often what happens is I will spend a week or two looking at the players, and then we'll take a bit of family time. But, I kind of feel a little bit like if the Seahawks are going to be competing a little bit more this year, then maybe I need to as well. So maybe that's going to stretch a little bit longer. There is obviously downtime and not a lot happening during the summer in terms of the NFL and college football. So there's always a time to get a bit of a break there. But got a lot of stuff to do over the next couple of weeks, so certainly won't be having a break anytime soon.
Well, check it out, SeahawksDraftBlog.com, at Rob Staton on Twitter. Rob, thanks again.
Anytime.
Thanks once again to Rob Staton for coming on the show. Also want to thank our sponsor for this week's show, Hims. forhims.com. The thing is, when you start to notice hair loss, it's usually too late. It's much easier to keep the hair that you have. I know, I look in the mirror sometimes and I go, yeah, is it starting to move back? I don't know, because I'm in the middle age time of my life, and when that kind of thing tends to happen. So I go to hims.com and there are answers. Fortunately, thanks to science, baldness can be optional. And the great thing about Hims, it connects you with real doctors, medical grade solutions. There's shampoo, there's other types of treatment. And I think my favorite thing, and I want to try this, is the Hims gummy bears. Because, if you can eat gummy bears and protect yourself from losing your hair, that just seems like a win-win to me. No waiting room, no awkward doctor's visits. You can save hours by going to forhims.com, answer a few quick questions. A doctor will review your order, prescribe you exactly what you need, and the products are shipped right to your front door. You can order right now. Our listeners get a trial month of Hims for just $5 today, right now, while supplies last. You can see the website for full details. This would cost hundreds if you went to the doctor or a pharmacy. Go to forhims.com/hawkers. That's forhims, forhims.com/hawkers, HAWKERS, forhims.com/hawkers. And now we bring on Samuel Gold of Sam's Film Room. Also posts a lot of his videos on field goals, so a contributor to Field Goals. Sam, welcome back to the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. Glad to be here.
I wanted to get some of your opinions now, because I know you're working on some videos with the Seahawks top picks. You've already done a video on Shaquem Griffin, and exciting for Seahawks fans to see him selected in the 5th round. But let's start off by talking about the Seahawks' first pick overall. They have every running back on the board, not named Saquon Barkley, to choose from at that 27th pick overall. And you see a lot of the names that were talked about, whether it's Sony Michel, whether it's Nick Chubb from both of those guys out of Georgia, or Darius Geis out of LSU. And instead, the Seahawks select Rashaad Penny, the running back out of San Diego.
Yeah, that was it's kind of the surprising one, definitely of all those picks. When they traded down, and I saw them sitting there at 27, I was like, oh man, I could see this going one of two ways. My first guess was actually Isaiah Oliver. I figured they would be going with that kind of the opposite corner to Shaquille Griffin, and looking for someone with that length that can play that press coverage, because honestly, he'd be a great fit for the system. And what's funny is that he actually got drafted by the Atlanta Falcons, and they run the same system.
Right.
So obviously they saw what I saw, and that's where I was expecting him. I was like, oh man, he's got that length that Carroll loves, and he'll be good. And then maybe maybe if they don't pick him, maybe they'll pick Darius Geis. So I was like, all right, Darius Geis, that's a great first down, second down back. They can do J.D. McKissick on third downs, and if C.J. Prosise ever stays healthy for longer than preseason, they'll play him at third down. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I guess to start, I would say it was surprising. I've had a late second, early third round grade on Rashaad Penny for the draft process. So to see him getting picked in the first round was the surprising thing.
Yeah.
For me, I would say after I spent a few hours today looking at his film, I could see why they like him. I could see why the Seahawks really like him. And he's a very good downhill runner. He's a type of running back who, once he gets started, he uses his momentum well to carry him down the field. If there's an arm tackle, or if there's one defender in the hole on that first level, like the way I break this up is that I see it as deep backfield, which is anything greater than 2 yards behind the line of scrimmage. I then see the at or near the line of scrimmage section at -1 to 0 to 1 yard past. And then I see second level as, between around 1 to 5 to 6. And then you have the third level, which is basically beyond that.
Yeah.
So that's kind of how I would kind of break it down in the first couple of levels. He is amazing at that level between the -1 to 1 yard and making people miss. And there was a Pro Football Focus statistic that kind of came out that was he missed 42% of his tackles at or behind the line of scrimmage. So when I saw that, I was like, oh my God, that's like
that's exactly what the Seahawks need.
It's exactly what they need. Like what's the missing thing that I did not see when I did my first kind of more brief film study of him a few weeks ago. So that was my goal today, was to kind of look back at the film and kind of figure out what's going on. And their whole thing is that it was at or behind the line of scrimmage. They did not say 3 yards behind the line of scrimmage like we see the Seahawks do, not 2 yards. It's right at or behind. So the whole thing is that, in my opinion, he's amazing at that 0 to 1 yard area or 0 to -1 yard area. But the thing is that he rarely had contact at the -2 to 3 yard range or even deeper. Because what they did was they lined him up in single back and I formation with a fullback, and then they just ran him downhill hard. They said, all right, attack the line of scrimmage, get there as fast as possible, and then make the first person miss and get into the second level where you can do your damage. And that's what he did, and he did it well. He was amazing at it.
Well, that's one of the things that I see commonly spoken about with Rashaad Penny is his vision. And I think it kind of speaks to that, the ability to find where the hole is in a short amount of time in that period of 1 to 2 yards behind the line of scrimmage.
Yeah, and that's exactly right. It's that I think he's really good at setting up his blocks in order to attack that line of scrimmage hole. And that's easily his best trait, in my opinion. That plus how he turns yards and falls forward and has a good forward lean. You kind of pair that with the initial ability to set up his block and get into that second level. That's great. That's one of my favorite things I like about him. And that's why I think he's worth a second to third round pick. But when you get to it, it's that deep backfield penetration that he just didn't have to deal with. Like you have Saquon Barkley. You turn on any Saquon Barkley film, you see guys 3 yards back there, 4 yards back there. You see Akram Wadley. You have an Iowa line that has a couple of really good players on it, James Daniels, for example, and you see him having to juke guys 3-4 yards back. That never happened with Rashaad Penny. And it's something that kind of bothered me, is that when you don't have time to build up your momentum, you kind of have to set your hips, you kind of have to step around, you kind of have to do this little shifty, subtle step in order to get by somebody to do that. When you're consistently on a track, consistently rolling, and consistently turning, you don't really have to do that. And that's why I think that Pro Football Focus stat of at or behind the line of scrimmage is a bit misleading, because it's, if someone got an arm on him at the 0 yard line marker and he broke that, because he broke a lot of those arm tackles right at the line of scrimmage, and then he gained 40 yards, that's going to completely destroy that metric.
Sure.
And he did. He destroyed that metric because of that.
Well, he was one of those guys, though, that when you did see him hit that second level, he rarely was coming down. I mean, he was off to the races at that point. So I'm curious, though, why the Seahawks, and you bring up that statistic, but what would you say that the Seahawks saw? Because, they were very physical type runners. And, it's not that Penny isn't physical. In fact, there's kind of the knock against Saquon Barkley is that he maybe went down a little bit too easily, and he was the number 2 overall pick. But then you have guys, like Nick Chubb, who are kind of those interior runners that, would take guys on and run them over. And I didn't necessarily see that from, and I think part of it as a Seahawks fan is you compare everybody to Marshawn Lynch now. And Rashaad Penny's not Marshawn Lynch. He's not going to, run into guys. But I think part of the thing is that after dealing with Thomas Rawls these last couple of years, the Seahawks looked at him and said, well, here's a guy that doesn't really have that vision, doesn't have that patience. And now we're going to, but he was the physical runner. Now maybe we'll give up some of that physical type nature of a running back and look more toward the vision and ability to, and some patience.
Set up his blocks. Yeah. Have patience to set up his blocks initially. It's how he presses the line, presses the hole, which allows his blocker to set up a cut lane and allows him to get an arm tackle versus a full body tackle. That's what he does well.
Yeah.
And that's something that's going to help the Seahawks. There's no doubt in my mind that he's a talented runner. I like him. Like it's not about whether or not I like the player. It's about liking the pick. And that's what this comes down to for me.
had the Seahawks, do you like the pick at 27, or would you have said, I would have rather seen him taken at the end of the second round and not really focus so much on where the pick happened, but just the player that the Seahawks get?
So here's the debate that I've kind of gone into, is that in an ideal world with for me, a late second, early third round grade, you take the Seahawks pick at 27 after they traded down the first time, and you trade down again to get somewhere in that 40s range, mid 40s, late 40s, 50, probably somewhere near closer to where Darius Geis was taken. Mm-hmm. That's an ideal world situation to me. The fact of the matter is that there was two reports that came out. The Browns wanted him at 33. The second thing was that another team tried to trade for him after the pick was made.
Yeah, very unusual.
So you have two data points that tell you maybe he's actually worth an early second round grade, or you can make the argument on the flip side is saying that there's two or three teams that were willing to reach on him a little bit earlier because they like the player.
Yeah.
If they got the player they like, I can get that argument. It's hard for me to justify it especially when it's a running back. Because if it's I took my cornerback a round early. If that was Isaiah Oliver and most people had a late second round grade or another cornerback that most people thought was going to be a late second round pick, and they took him at 27, that position of value is just so different. Like I would say, I'm going to trust them because they have a history of developing him, but it's the Seahawks in the run game, and I don't have a trust in that at all.
Yeah. No, I think we've been burned by that as Seahawks fans. But one place that we do seem to trust the Seahawks is their ability to find guys on the defensive line, and they were able to do that with their second pick overall. In the third round, they get Rasheem Green out of USC, a big, 275-pound defensive end, and who also played on the interior in college.
Yeah, and so with Rasheem Green at USC, you get a tall, long defender who's a little bit lean and upright and narrow in his stance. You get a guy that with USC, they lined him up at that 3-tech defensive tackle position pretty much every single down, except for the rare occasion where they pushed him out to. They also played him at 5-tech, I guess, as well, but it's more frequently he was the defensive tackle in their scheme. And they had a couple of smaller guys that were standing up in 2-point stances that rushed. I think what they saw was that he would be a good interior penetrator. Or at least that's what USC saw in replacing him there. What I see from Rasheem Green is I see a guy that he's not going to be a defensive tackle in the pros on first and second downs. He's simply not strong enough. He's simply not good enough with his base, and he's simply not good enough with his ability to withstand blocks, especially double teams and even single blocks. You turn on the Notre Dame game, which was a fascinating experience for me, and it was Quentin Nelson buried him down the field 10 yards, and he pancaked him to the ground. He made a panini out of him. It was a point of contention where I was like, oh my God, he just got destroyed. And then you see him occasionally, tight ends had their way with him. Occasionally you would see guys that would chip him after the play, and he would just like sit there and take it. I just did not get the feeling at all that USC used him correctly. I don't think so. And that's why I feel like when people see Rasheem Green, they see a project. They see a guy that he's not going to be an amazing starter in his first year. Might not even be an amazing starter in his second year. You see a guy that you're going to have to develop. You're going to have to put time into it. You're going to have to be patient with his ability to translate and become an edge defender. Basically a full-time 5-tech, kind of similar to the Michael Bennett role. I mean, you compare their size, and they're literally the same size coming out of college.
Yeah.
6'4", 274, 275? They're the same size. So I get it that on third downs, he'll come inside to that defensive tackle role and be a penetrator and use his length, and hopefully he'll develop some pass rush moves and be that guy. Just right now, he's not strong enough to hold the point of attack at all. He was bulldozed down the field way too many times. There were points where I saw him make a tackle 10 yards down the field, and I was like, how did he get down there? And then I watched it closely, and it was because the center and Quentin Nelson carried him 10 yards down the field, and then he was there to make a tackle, and he grabbed the running back. It was like, why is he even here right now?
Well, I think it sounds like it speaks to why Quentin Nelson was taken so highly too.
No, I mean, yeah, that's exactly what I got out of it. Was like, oh man, Nelson's worth it. He's a top 10 guy. I get it. And so I guess my conclusion on Rasheem Green, and this is his overall technique and his footwork and his base. Frankly, it's not good. You don't look at him and say, oh man, he's a good player right now. He's not. If he never develops his technique, his footwork, and his strength, he's a bust. He's a hardcore bust if I've ever seen a bust. He will not survive in the NFL. But if he develops his strength, he turns into an average starter. If he develops his strength and his technique, you look at an impact player that you got in the third round. So that's the gamble. It's that, does he have those intangibles to say, I'm going to work at my technique, I'm going to be coachable, and I'm going to be a guy that Pete Carroll and Coach Clint, I think that's his name, the defensive line coach with the Seahawks.
Clint Hurt.
Yeah, and so if you can coach him and turn him into a good player, I like the idea of that, and I like his length, and I like his upfield burst because he flashed. If you watch his highlights, you saw a guy that was a little bit raw, a little bit uncontrolled, a little bit flashy in terms of his ability to penetrate and make plays. But when you actually sit there and chart all of his plays, you were left wanting more. You were left feeling like he was way too content at being blocked, that he would get tired late in games, and that I didn't feel like his effort was always there. I felt like, especially when you watch, so you look at the Notre Dame game when they were down by 30 points in the final quarter, and the guy, he pretty much loafed around and didn't really do anything more. And like, okay, so that's Notre Dame, and they're getting destroyed, so that's the case. But then you look at like a game like Colorado, and then it's the same thing in the fourth quarter where he isn't on fire with his effort and his ability to keep fighting and chasing, and he's just not that guy, in my opinion.
Interesting.
And I'm guessing that they interviewed him a lot, and they basically spoke to him, and they talked to coaches around him that told him, because Pete Carroll has all the relationships there still, that they probably got the intel that he's coachable, he's a good kid, and that type of stuff. He has to be. But his demeanor is not something that I expected. I expected a guy that'd be effort driven, fierce, and angry. And I saw a guy that was a little bit loafing, a little bit too casual. And maybe that's just me watching the tape, and I felt like too many times when the play got outside of him, he didn't get that second level. He wasn't that gang tackling defensive tackle or defensive end that I want to see do that.
Well, it's a couple of the things that you've said that's a little bit interesting to me is that, playing him out of position or out of the position that you would expect him to see at the NFL level. I mean, that was something that they saw with Malik McDowell and why they went and drafted him so early in the second round, because they thought that once they move him around, his game could translate at the different position. Now, there are other things going on with him, but I also look back at a guy that in college that maybe you didn't see a whole lot, like Frank Clark. And when they picked him at the end of the second round a couple years ago, he had a really impressive bull rush. And that was kind of his big move in college. And you looked at that and go, well, he's not going to be able to do that every down on the NFL level. But they've been able to coach him to become a lot more versatile type player. So I do like the Seahawks' ability to, and in the past, just what they've been able to do with defensive linemen.
And that's the kind of the sticking point to me, is that it depends on if I'm developing a defensive player, a defensive front seven player, or a secondary player with the Seahawks, I have more trust than I do with other teams. I think that if he proves to me that he can learn and that he's coachable and that he's a guy that will actually turn up the effort as an edge defender versus as an interior defensive lineman where he's getting shoved around by a Quentin Nelson and the other guards and centers, I think there's a chance he could turn into a good player.
Let's move on and let's talk about a guy that you already covered in your video series on field goals, and that's Shaquem Griffin, the linebacker out of the national champion.
Yeah, I wanted Central Florida to be in the college playoffs. That's exactly why you have to expand it.
They're undefeated.
Exactly. They're undefeated. You cannot have an undefeated team not in, especially for their schedule and the teams they faced. He should have been the fourth team in.
That's why I'm okay with University of Central Florida calling themselves national champions. That's it doesn't hurt my feelings.
Like 100% agreed.
But Shaquem Griffin, they get him in the 5th round, and I think you documented some of the issues of Shaquem Griffin's game in that video, but there's also some really exciting things that we've seen from him as well.
Definitely. He's a good, smart player, and he's athletic, and that's something that he's an instant. His speed, his understanding of where the play is going usually, and overall, I think that's an instant asset on special teams duties first and foremost.
Yeah.
I think that's going to be his bread and butter. That's where he has to start playing. Is he's going to make the team as a special teamer, and he's going to learn. They're going to be patient and teach him to be, in my opinion, an off the ball, strong side linebacker, a Sam linebacker in the 4-3 base. I think they're going to be patient with him if he keeps killing it as a special teamer.
Yeah, it's interesting that you bring up the strong side backer, because that's kind of what I pictured him as well. And then in the press conference, the post-draft press conference, they talked about him as a weak side linebacker.
It's interesting.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess if you want to go that route, I think they might want to use his speed off the line of scrimmage if they want to use him blitzing and rushing. Typically in your 4-3 under front, that weak side linebacker will sit on the line of scrimmage, and he's sitting outside of the tight end typically, or sorry, on the opposite side, and basically, man, that's a good question. I don't know. I don't know why you want to.
I don't know either necessarily, because that's immediately when I saw your video, when we talked about him, I saw him more as the strong side backer. But it may be that he is a player that is for very specific situations, and maybe somebody you bring on, on pass rushing downs, because simply because of his ability to affect the quarterback and what he did, especially the senior season.
I get it from a speed perspective. And I get it from an unblocked. You don't want him to deal with having to disengage with the one hand, and it's a legitimate concern. It's disengaging with one hand on a good tight end if they get their hands on them. That's a legitimate concern with somebody like that.
Well, and where they project him as, and then where he ultimately ends up playing could be different as well.
I guess that's my point. Is he a rotational behind Frank Clark, and then you want Rasheem Green to be your future strong side edge defender? I mean, the Seahawks are typically in a 4-2 the entire time with Bobby Wagner and KJ Wright. I'll have to think about that.
Well, and it could be, too, that KJ Wright does have flexibility to his game. Yeah,
because I would have guessed he would have been a future heir apparent to KJ Wright, actually.
And that could be. Maybe that's what they see him as, because KJ Wright in the final year of his deal this year.
Because when I see KJ Wright, I see a guy that typically, I mean, Bobby Wagner's usually the Mike, but the way the Seahawks run, they don't always keep him in distinct roles, especially if like a tight end shifts. They don't say like, oh, you're only the Mike, or you're only you're the Will. It's not like you're the Mike, you're the Will. They switch based on whatever the tight end's doing. And if you're looking at KJ Wright, I'm looking it up online. You see he's 6'4", 246. How big is Shaquem Griffin?
He's 6 feet, 229.
And it's a smaller position, and it's, I guess you can.
But KJ Wright's unusually large, I think, for a Will linebacker too.
But I figured that's what they would want with Bobby Wagner and KJ Wright, having two bigger moving linebackers in order to be in the nickel defense the entire time. Like I viewed Shaquem Griffin more like the Deion Jones role from Atlanta, 6'1", 222. So they're the same size. And he was considered that hybrid linebacker safety role, which is more similar to what I had Shaquem Griffin as, minus the safety part, because I don't think he's good enough in space to play that. I didn't see the instincts to play safety.
To me, his strength in college was getting to and affecting the quarterback. And so if it's, he's the nickel linebacker that comes in on pass rushing downs.
It's a good point, but the issue is that the way he affected the pass rusher, or as a pass rusher in college, was based off of his speed. He was more of like he was a flashy, more like a flash edge rusher. with that speed and burst, and he got a lot of his plays with that second level effort.
Yeah.
If he did that in the NFL, he'd be collecting effort sacks, which there's nothing wrong with an effort sack. I'm all for it. It's just you're not affecting the QB in a traditional manner like a Frank Clark would with his hand usage. He just wouldn't have that ability to penetrate and power over, like have that variety of a pass rush move on the edge. He's just not big enough.
Well, I appreciate you working through that with me, Sam. I'm curious overall, if you, just in general with the Seahawks draft, your takeaway from it from an outsider's perspective.
My takeaway from an outsider's perspective.
Well, you're a Skins fan, so I mean, you're not. You have a little bit. You don't have as much homerism to you as maybe I do.
Yeah, I got you. I would say there are some questionable decisions. I would say that Rashaad Penny pick was the most questionable. Second most questionable was you get into the punter debate on whether or not a punter is even worth drafting, let alone trading up for. I wasn't that offended by that. I didn't care about that. That was if I'm going to use a fifth rounder for one of the best punters in basically college history over the last couple of years, as a possible replacement for John Ryan, who wasn't even great last year. He was a guy that they owe $3.2 million and $3.6 million over the next 2 years. So you're going to save a bunch of cap space if they can replace him this offseason. That's what I see from that pick. And at a fifth rounder, you're paying such a small dollar amount and small. It didn't bother me nearly as much as what it did from other people.
And you're talking about trading up. They traded a mid 7th round pick, which is essentially nothing to move up a few spots.
Exactly. And if you really like that punter and you don't think there's another option that's going to be as cheap, I'm okay with that. That decision doesn't bother me. The other thing I think we noticed also was the lack of early round defensive back position picks. I didn't expect a safety. I only expected them to take a safety if they traded Earl Thomas, which as we can tell, they didn't.
Right.
And if they did trade him, I would have expected someone like Jeremy Bates or Justin Reed.
Yeah.
Someone like that to take over as a free safety role. Let's see. So I guess the lack of the cornerback position was a little bit startling.
And we did hear that Byron Maxwell on, I think it was before the second day of the draft. Yeah, that Byron Maxwell was signed to a 1-year, $3 million deal. So
I expect him to. I think I expect him to start outside of Shaquille.
Yeah.
For some reason, he fits what the Seahawks do versus every other team.
We'll take it.
That's what you call a dollar per value signing.
Yeah. He
really is a dollar per value signing, especially at was it $3 million max contract?
Right.
For like a potential starting cornerback. That's good with me. I think offensive lineman early. I expected a right tackle. Jamarco Jones I feel like he's hit or miss in terms of who you talk to. He's unathletic in terms of the combine. He didn't test well. But I have a friend of mine, Brandon Thorne, who's a huge offensive line scout guy on Twitter that you can follow him there. He likes him. He thinks he's well worth that. He saw him like in the 3rd round, so getting him, I think it was the end of the 5th. That's great value.
Yeah.
So maybe he can turn into that right tackle.
And they talked about putting him behind Dwayne Brown and moving George Fant over to compete at the right tackle position, which was interesting.
Yeah, and I agree with that. I think George Fant should compete at right tackle.
Yeah.
Everyone should compete at right tackle. I mean, like, they should get Pete Carroll out there and compete at right tackle.
Then you can pick the best one.
I guess, so overall, I think they filled some obvious needs. The tight end, Will Dissly, is a good blocking tight end, and they needed that. They really need that for this type of scheme. So that's a fine pick. That's right around where I expected him to go. I think it was overall. I think they filled some of the obvious needs that they had. They got Shaquem Griffin, which is I think pairing him with Shaquille will be fun to watch. So I think that's a definite plus. You could see the Rashaad. You could see the Rasheem Green pick as an upside potential pick. So I guess I would probably put the draft in that B minus range.
Okay.
It's hard because the running back, I honestly, as much as I like the player, I don't like the pick. And you can make, and it all comes back to just the value of the position, the fact that, I mean, there's been studies done. I know Ben Baldwin at Field Goals did a pretty extensive breakdown on Football Outsiders, and basically rushing success
Right.
That you don't need to take a running back early. As much as I want to trust the pure statistics beyond it, I think there is some more schematic reasons why running the ball is important, even if it doesn't directly show up in the stats. And that's something that it's not that I want to contradict him, because I don't disagree with them.
Mm-hmm.
I do agree that the position, you can do a rotation of third or fourth round backs and you can get a good enough backfield to compete. I think it's you use your early picks on the trenches and then you fill the rest of them with second, third, fourth round picks. And that's the only reason why I would say that pick is more like a DD plus range for me. But the rest of the picks I was fine with, and I think C plus B minus range is right around where I have it.
One more question on that. If you do draft at number 27 for a running back with everybody else on the board except for Barkley, who do you take? Or maybe it's just the philosophical idea of not taking a running back in the first round, and that's more of your issue with it.
So I guess this is something I didn't mention in the Penny analysis. He doesn't really do it for me in pass blocking. He was very, very not good in pass blocking.
That's been the knock on him, was his pass blocking, right?
And I know Pete Carroll mentioned his receiving ability. I didn't see that either. I don't know. And maybe they tested him individually,
mm-hmm.
and they're okay with it as it is. But I saw a guy that I see him as a first and second down back, goal line potential, short yardage potential. I also see him. It's kind of random. It's third and long as a draw running back.
Sure,
running draws. Something that Thomas Rawls could not do to save his life.
Right. He'd just run into a dude.
He'd do it. Yeah. He'd run into a dude and not press the obvious hole.
Yeah.
But Rashaad Penny just bursts, man.
Yeah.
Like he's a light switch. It's not even that he has multiple speeds. It's either on or off. And he could do that on draw runs out of shotgun and third and long. It's random, but he's really good at that.
Well, it's not that random, because if Jermaine Ifedi is starting at right tackle again, we could be in some third and longs, much like we were last year.
Exactly. So I guess you mentioned from the philosophical point of view about taking a running back early, I think you have to be a better pass catcher and you have to be a better pass blocker.
Yeah.
In order for me to spend a first round on you. If you're not that, you have to be an elite running back in terms of running ability.
So the Sony Michel pick to the Patriots, you probably have less of an issue with.
Yes, I have Sony Michel as an early second round grade.
Yeah.
I had, for reference, I actually had Rashaad Penny's my fourth rated guy, actually.
Okay.
I had him and Nick Chubb as closely rated. Rashaad Penny getting the edge, actually, even though I do like Chubb a lot.
So Michel and Geis were the two ahead.
I see Barkley, Geis, Michel as my top three, Penny as my four, Chubb as my five. And what's kind of interesting is that Chubb was taken in early second, and you can argue that was a little bit early too, but it's still not you can go back and say, oh, it's not a first rounder. But I think you have to be an elite running prospect or be a B plus running prospect like Rashaad Penny and have a B level pass blocking, pass catching overall ability. With Darius Geis, I had him as a top tier runner,
mm-hmm.
but his pass blocking again is crap. Most of these guys are crap.
I think Michel was the one guy who was rated the highest in pass blocking. Yeah.
Sony Michel's pretty decent. I don't think he had a ton of reps. Yeah, I rated him higher than most. Saquon Barkley still got the number one spot. Kerryon Johnson actually got my number 2 pass blocker grade.
Yeah.
And he went early second as well.
Yeah, to the Lions. I think, the 11th pick in the second round.
Random story. It looks like the Skins were trying to grab Kerryon Johnson with their pick. So Lions jumped ahead, grabbed Kerryon Johnson. We trade down because we don't want to take Geis there, I guess. And then we grab that extra third, get Geis later in the second, and that made me super happy. But anyways, back to the Seahawks. I expected, if you don't have the versatility early on, if you're not an immediate contributor as a pass blocker or can easily pick it up, and as a pass catcher running more routes than just checkdowns, flares, and screens, then you have a problem. I can't justify taking a first and second down back only as in the first round. Geis was so borderline for me
mm-hmm.
that I actually had him as a late first, early second grade, in the sense of I thought he's a better runner. I thought he's a better pure runner than Rashaad Penny. Again, I said blocking wasn't good, but he has potential. And then you have his receiving, which I think is was just never tested. It goes back to that where I think that because Geis is a better runner, I give him a better grade, even though they don't fully have it with their receiving and blocking abilities.
I guess the takeaway then is that there are a lot of those running backs that were all kind of similar in ability that went all about the same time.
Yeah, and like even like Sony Michel, he's not even elite running prospect.
Yeah.
I think the national championship game and the game before that against Oklahoma definitely inflated his stock in terms of people's opinion on him as a runner. But I think he's currently like a B range in all three categories. So it's like he could be a good he's the overall player the Patriots love.
Mm-hmm.
And so I see him doing really well for them because of that.
Well, Sam, wanted to thank you for coming back on the show. And if people want to check out your stuff, I know you're on Field Goals, on YouTube. Anywhere else we can find you?
Yep. Twitter, Samuel R. Gold. You can find me there.
Sam, thanks once again.
Yeah, sure thing. Glad to be on it.
Well, thanks again to Sam Gold. And also thanks again to Rob Staton coming on the show, helping me fill in while Adam is on the road for work to give you guys a post-draft recap of what the Seahawks have done. Of course, Adam and I will be back a little bit later, either later this week, early next week, to talk about our thoughts. I know you're going to want to hear what Adam has to say. If you didn't know, going into the draft, he was particularly focused on offensive line. Instead, they went running back. They're still addressing the run game, but maybe not to his liking. So I'm sure he'll have something to say about that. Before I get out of here, I want to send a shout out to Garrett in Northern Ontario. Happy birthday, buddy. Got an email from your girlfriend who said that your birthday was right around now and wanted a little shout out on the show. So appreciate you being a member of the flock, and to all our members of the flock at getintheflock.com. Coming up this next show, we'll be thanking all of our $12 members and above. That does it for this week's show. With that, there's only one thing left to say. Go Hawks.